Okay, so moving on. So we're talking a lot about complexity, and you can see, especially with the ending conversation of the last panel, things are getting more complex when we start to talk about biological printing. So in this session, we really want to talk about what it takes to make this real. We want to look at entrepreneurial perspectives, what does this implicate for businesses, small and larger companies, and just talk about regulations, all sorts of things of that sort. So first to introduce, on your left, we have Joel Wishkovsky, and he's a co-founder of Souls, and he's now currently involved in Smart Vision Labs. So if you want to introduce yourself further, it'd be great.
Sure. I'm Joel Wishkovsky, at Joel Wish on Twitter. I'm a co-founder of a company called Souls Systems, which 3D prints custom orthotics, like Invisalign and like Scott's Bespoke Innovations, one of the first companies to take advantage of 3D printing and actually making a business out of it. Also kind of a serial entrepreneur, involved in a couple companies. I also advise, and I've been involved in a couple of nonprofits to do 3D printing prosthetics overseas and in underserved populations.
Next, we have Andy Miller. So he's also with 3D Systems, and he's a product design with medical systems.
Great, thanks. So my name's Andy Miller. I was the second engineer with Bespoke Innovations and Scott Summit, which carried me into 3D Systems. So I've worked on the range of bracing products. Now I'm currently involved in products with medical modeling and surgical and implanted and virtual surgical planning. So we can talk about that. My background is bioengineering and industrial design, and I spent some time designing minimally invasive surgical tools and designing global health products before I started a 3-year career in 3D printing.
And we now know Jon Schull, but perhaps you can give a new introduction that's more suited towards
My
this
name
panel.
has not changed, but I will share that I've had several careers, and they all turn out to be somewhat relevant to this conversation. I wanted to be a scientist when I grew up, and I got a PhD in biological psychology, studied animal behavior and evolution and adaptation and that kind of thing, all very airy-fairy. But then I became a programmer and became an entrepreneur for 12 years, working on digital rights management and early internet commerce and things on the World Wide Web. Then I became a professor of human factors, back to academia, teaching human-computer interaction and teaching courses in innovation and invention. And now I'm doing this other thing while still in an academic environment as actually with the title of research scientist, but it's not clear that what I'm doing is science. And I'm doing this whole social entrepreneurial venture, which is taking off, and yet the whole question of what kind of a startup or business model it has is entirely unclear. So all bets are off.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to Joel. I'm reminded of a conversation I once had with him, and I want to use this as an example to start to really clarify when it makes sense to utilize 3D printing. We're now talking, let's say, in a business sense. So whether we're printing 1 or 30,000 things, what are those parameters that start to talk about the feasibility, economy, and worth of 3D printing?
Yeah, so when I started Souls, I drew a triangle on a whiteboard and had 3 kind of aspects that you're going to look for something that's 3D printable. And for medical, take a step back. One of the things that I have to do as an entrepreneur and kind of what I've been doing with the newest business, Smart Vision Labs, is democratizing access to health and medical products and healthcare. And when I went out looking for what can be done with 3D printing, what can be done in the healthcare space, drew a triangle on the board. So what were the 3 characteristics of a product that could be 3D printed at scale, making money, and have an impact in health? The first was an inherent need for customization. It's where 3D printing really shines. It's what Scott said, complexity is free. The second is high margins, so a lot of things in healthcare are great fits. And the third is geometry. We didn't really get to talk about it in the last panel, but it's really important. There are a lot of ways to make things. There are hundreds of ways of making different things, from injection molding to bending. Not everything is right for 3D printing, and a lot of those other methods are computer controlled. So you can make a 3D design on Tinkercad or something else, and you can make it on a CNC axis milling machine. You don't have to 3D print it. But for 3D printing, what's really great is that you can create structures that weren't possible with other kinds of mechanisms. So you can create structures inside of structures, or structures that vary in like the thickness of the walls. So like a great example in soles, and one of the reasons the aha moment we were like, this product is going to be revolutionary, was we are making insoles that aren't one thickness. Traditionally, you get an orthotic, you go to a store, you get an insole, they're one thickness because they've been milled out of a single piece of plastic. But since we're 3D printing it, some parts that we make are hollow. And it allows us to start modeling how the human gait works and start to use those hollow spaces and changes in structure on the inside to change how those different properties across the footbed react. And there are a whole bunch of other applications and similar across the medical space.
So I completely agree with that. Anytime you have complexity or anytime you have the necessity for personalization, it's a really good fit with 3D printing. But I wanted to build on that just by saying that there's also a third indication for using 3D printing, and that's if you have a low production run. So you could make a device for just your hospital, or you could make a device for global health without having to invest in hundreds of thousands of dollars of tooling. And then the last part of that idea is that you want to look at the entire life cycle cost of your device. So for example, the military has a tremendous overhead per part because there's a bureaucracy and paperwork involved in every part. So if you can take an object that has 16 parts and reduce it to 4 using 3D printing and print the parts together, then you can reduce the overhead. So that's one example of being creative and looking at the broader picture.
I want to add one thing. You mentioned tooling, and I think a lot of people don't know what that means. With 3D printing, you have a 3D model and you press print and it gets made. With other types of manufacturing technologies, you actually have to invest in kind of molds and other things that have to be made separately that make your unit. Some of these things can go from very small, simple parts like $10,000 to literally hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So it only makes sense to make those parts when you have millions. So it's a great use case.
So let's go back to Jon and talk about his price points. So we're talking about a system where we're creating incredible products, changing people's lives. So can you talk about the maybe reverse model of what's going on and how that has other further implications?
Right. Well, we don't fully understand. I mean, frankly, the entrepreneur realizes they don't understand their market either. But I'm pretty sure that we don't understand fully what we're doing and why it's working. But at this point, we've, not to oversell the story, we've probably, our members have produced perhaps 100 hands. And virtually all of them have been given away for free. The material costs of the 3D printing is $5 to $15. The metal screws that make the hinges cost more than the hands themselves, and we've eliminated them in the new model gray hand that's circulating right now. And those costs are just being absorbed by the various makers who find it so rewarding and so exciting to be at the front and cutting edge of so many interesting movements that they're doing it for free. Now, this is something that, is just sort of bizarre. And it's bizarre because it couldn't happen without all of the free social and communication media, which we take for granted but didn't exist this way 20 years ago, and because of these new commodity devices, which also are just coming into existence. The real point is there is a new landscape present, and the question of whether the most effective way to get new things into practice in the world is necessarily through business at all is, I think, a really interesting question. I'm not at all opposed to business. I've done the entrepreneurial thing. I'm trying to figure out a nonprofit model for my organization. But I do think it's worth noting that just as software distribution became a non-industry, hardware
No.
And maybe even hardware fabrication. Maybe even hardware fabrication is going to become, under some conditions at least, a commodity of negligible cost.
I think where we could continue there is finding, as we spoke about once, this kind of fascinating part as we start to approach the topic of regulations, how this topic financially has actually played into then how things are regulated and whether or not FDA is looking at them. So perhaps we're with you, John, or we're without Mike.
Sure.
We can start there and then move across.
I think this one's never dead. As are we all. Right. One of the reasons commercial prosthetics can cost $40,000 because they have to go through FDA. Insurance companies covered by insurance and FDA approval. And of course the manufacturing costs, which, because it's for a medical environment and there's a certain cachet about medical technology, will be made as if material costs were of no significance, right? Nothing but the best for our patients, given that we've gone through FDA approval, we've gotten liability covered by medical insurance. A lot of expensive hoops to jump through. And right now, we happen to be operating in a loophole because our mechanical hands are not motorized, not charging for them, and they are upper limb prosthetics. Those turn out not to be subject to FDA approval today. Now, I will say that the FDA has looked at these issues and hoping to help them get the regulatory landscape right for the new era. But that's one of the reasons that the price structure could be really, really different in the brave, nice new world we're trying to create.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with 3D systems and our surgical practice with medical modeling, we absolutely have products and processes, manufacturing, as well as finished medical devices that have gone through the full burden of FDA regulation and validation. So that's something that as a practice there's still a place for it, and it's something that we have as a capacity within the company. But I think it's also interesting to play off of your point, which is that 3D printing is an enabling technology. And so it's going to be enabling all of these new business models, really. So I think it's good to think of it as a new paradigm, as a new platform, and start asking questions, well, what does it mean if you can share a standard of care across the world in another country? It's going to be, the next 10 years, we're going to start answering the questions of how can regulation keep up? How can IP keep up? But I think that the capacity to produce things is leapfrog with 3D printing. So, brave new world.
So Vinod Khosla, who's from here, I think he was here last year. Was a keynote here last year. He said something really interesting. I think he said it at this conference last year. He said someone asked him about FDA and what we're going to do about your companies who need FDA approval, and he's like, the world is really big. And I think he's really right.
Yeah.
I talk to so many entrepreneurs who are doing things in the medical space. Even us, Smart Vision Labs, are like, is the U.S. the right market to start with? And certainly with Enabled and many other kinds of products. There's so much less barriers because there's no FDA, and people are okay knowing the risks, the things that they're using, and certainly some things like hands have little risks, but even other things where they have no options, like they're going to suffer badly, and this product may not be perfect, but it gets like 90% there.
So I wanted to add just one last point, which is that we're used to a product development process that originates with a designer, with a company, but with 3D printing and co-creation, democratized design, patients can now be designers. So patients can say what their needs are, they can meet those needs, and that's co-opting sort of old hierarchy. So we're going to see a lot of new innovation coming directly from patients expressing their needs.
Yeah, You hold that, and I'll just hold this. I just want to reinforce that. Many of you are connected with the medical profession, go figure, because of the nature of this conference. And we've been talking about 3D printing more or less in the abstract. But there is a tsunami coming, of which this is, I think, a really interesting case, but just an example of where research and development of medical technologies, research and epidemiology of disease by patients, for patients, and the distribution of knowledge are all going to get outside of the walls of the hospital and the medical research institutions. What's happening with 3D printing and, for example, prosthetic hands, which happens to be operating a loophole, I think is going to go across the board, including things like pharmaceuticals, because we're going to have 3D printers and we're going to be, cooking our own organisms, and all sorts of things. So, and these things happen quickly once they start happening. So the medical students in the room are probably hearing as much about their future from me right now as they're hearing from their professors in class right now. It's going to change a lot.
So I agree with that. I also think that there's still, there's a lot of space out there in healthcare, and I think that there's, a very good place and reason for current regulatory environments and the current workflows, and 3D printing is going to be affecting those value chains as well. And a good example are the medical modeling products, which we've got on show upstairs, but really difficult to do reconstructions, virtual surgical planning, doing the operation ahead of time, and then conference calling with the surgeon, 3D printing, both surgical guides and patient-specific implants. These are all really good examples of 3D printing affecting traditional healthcare, fitting within the constructs of current regulatory environments. And it's really important to look at both ends of the extreme.
So maybe even
Don't have a mic?
coming back to this idea that individuals can now affect businesses are obviously why. But maybe coming back to the business sense of really being clear that there's prototyping and then talking about production processes.
This is great.
Now, and how that's enabling.
Sure. Well, I can jump in. Historically, if you wanted to sell somebody an idea, you'd be shipping them a product, and that product had to be manufactured somewhere. Now you can sell somebody an idea, a solution that's a digital file, and it's something that somebody else can co-create. I think, this is a little bit tangential, but a good example is upstairs we have an arm scanner, which is a specific solution to produce arm braces and fracture braces, but it's a good example of co-creation. So we have an iPad where a patient can pick preferences, and they can pick, so they're affecting the design of the digital file. And what you're really selling is the digital asset. And then, everybody's going to be able to have the equal capacity to manufacture the device. So it sort of an intellectual twist to the old way of producing and sharing and commoditizing products. And this is true in healthcare as well as every other field.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the last question real quick, because I did have something to add. I'm just now thinking about it. We're talking a little bit about how you don't necessarily have to sell something for it to be really valuable, and you can create businesses and get things out into the world by not giving them away. But I think it's really important to note that all of the advances, not all of them, but 99% of the advances in 3D printing come from companies searching for profits. The medical space and some of these plastics that you see here took millions of dollars of research to develop. The mechanisms were perfected over years, protected by patents, and I think that doesn't change. There's a lot of companies, especially in the realm that we're talking about in medical and aerospace, that are investing tens of millions of dollars in new materials, in new mechanisms, in bioprinting, and that money would just not be there if there wasn't a market. And those same things can be trickled down into free product, like it has with the thing now FDM printing, which is off patent. But I think it's really important to know that money and that investment and this time. This whole conversation has resulted from people making money off of the products.
Yep.
Oh, point.
That's a valid point.
So maybe now to go into, well, we've talked about all the various fields that are using this technology, but now we can talk about even in the medical realm, where are these machines, where are they located, where can the labs be? There are instances of hospitals that are starting to have design teams or technicians on site to kind of live develop things as they arrive.
Yeah. I might start with that question. I think it's a really good question, especially with the products inside of 3D systems. So we have a product line where we don't rely on a team of designers to make and instantiate the product. We've actually developed software, and I believe Souls did the same thing, where you can upload to the cloud a patient-specific scan. So the workflow changes a little bit, and then the product can be automatically instantiated through software. And that reduces costs, but it also enforces a standard of care, and it still allows for flexibility through parametric design. So I think that that's one way that you're seeing healthcare being disrupted with 3D printing.
Invisalign actually does the exact same thing. You get your well, now you actually do molds and they 3D scan the molds, but the doctor, the orthodontist or the dentist sees the plan. And you can call Invisalign and be like, hey, this patient has this or this. I want it to be done this way. And actually can change what the software said, and the software automatically updates itself. And working with an orthodontist in the cloud.
Yeah. So, there are 3 steps. At least we describe it, 3D systems, that there are 3 steps in 3D printing. You've got scan, design, and print. That's one workflow. So if you have a scanning technology housed at a local facility, and then you have distributed manufacturing where you start getting some of these high-end, more sophisticated printers closer, you can start to close the time loop on producing a patient-specific device. And I think that's really exciting.
So I think one of the questions I got a lot from doctors, surgeons, others, like, well, I currently make some of the products that I put in the patient. I charge the healthcare company for those products. If I stop making them, I won't be able to reap the benefits from I won't get paid for it. And I think one of the problems with 3D printing right now is some of the mechanisms to make these products, especially with SLS and SLA, these machines are super expensive, and they're also not suited for a hospital environment. They're really industrial, they're messy, there's dust, it's not good for patients to be around. And the way that you justify having those printers is by maximizing output. A $1 million machine you need to have to have it running all the time over its entire lifespan for you to be able to make a profit or for it to even make sense. So you don't have like a $400,000 back brace. And that's better suited for it's called like a medical lab environment like they have for dentistry.
Yeah, an innovation lab. One last point on that, and this is just a little bit more detail to educate about 3D printing, but one of the questions that I receive staffing a table upstairs is, how long does it take to print something? And maybe it takes 4 or 14 hours to print something, but that's if you're printing one object. Many of the larger printers, you can fit 300 Invisalign braces into the printer, and it takes 14 hours, but you divide that by 300, and you've got the true time and cost of printing that device. So it's all about efficiency, packing, and amortization at that point.
And Invisalign actually has really pushed the envelope on those machines. Those aren't machines you buy off the shelf. Invisalign machines, if you look, you can go, I ask you to go on YouTube and check out this video. They only have like 2 employees in their entire manufacturing facility. They produce millions, 17.8 million braces. And they have like 2 people in the factory. It's all automated. These machines have been hacked to produce these braces, and that's what you really need for a lot of these kind of cutting-edge products.
I think the only thing I would add to all of this, and these guys are the experts, is that part of the story is that there's just a huge diversity now of possibilities, and I don't think it's clear how they're going to settle out. In addition to what they've said, for example, there are companies, there's one out of MIT, which is providing hackerspaces for hospitals for the nurses to use. It turns out the nurses are often the ones who are crafting patient-specific solutions. And so let's give them the tools, and that probably includes a consumer grade printer so that they can just tinker with it themselves. But once that's worked out, it may then go to this miraculous Invisalign machine for mass production, or it may then go to injection molding, or it may go somewhere else. There's going to be a diversity of approaches here, like printing, for example. Sometimes you pick up a pen and you move it across paper yourself. Sometimes you use a word processor and you print. Sometimes you use the Xerox machine. Sometimes it goes to the printer or the bindery or some other thing. None of those are exotic technologies, and they're all at radically different scales. Those are going to get mixed and matched in ways that we're just beginning to imagine.
We talked a little bit about niche production, right? You need one unit. You don't need to have 10 units, or just no one else is going to want the thing you just created. There's also this subset of middleware where you have a nurse who wants a special device to do this, where there might be 200 nurses in the US or other places that would want that thing. She or he can make that item, put it online, and any nurse anywhere else can come and download that. Now those are kinds of products that traditionally just never got made. Literally, the solution just never was because there was no market for it. No entrepreneur was going to go out there and attack that market. But now there's solutions being made.
Yeah. I mean, I would just put a terminology onto that, which is orphan drugs and orphan products. So, the patients that are on the tail, the 1 in a billion, that they're going to get solutions out of this.
I'd like to hear a question from the audience. I don't know. I'm forgetting that I'm picking.
I'll pick.
Yeah, that's right.
A decisive entrepreneur.
I was wondering, what are the legal and ethical issues, if any, with 3D printing? For example, you could essentially.
Yeah. I'll start with that one. So, I can answer the ethical and legal question in two ways. You're going to look at both manufacturing quality, and you're also going to look at, design quality. So if you have pure, complete customization, how does it fit a billing code? How does it fit a validation scheme through the FDA? And how do you ensure that you get the particular output? Especially, an example is a patient-specific device. So that's an open question, and it's really mandatory. I mean, these regulatory bodies exist so that you deliver what you say you're going to deliver to the patient, but with pure customization, how does that work? And then the other one is from a manufacturing standpoint. How do you validate your machine? How do you validate your process? How do you validate your materials? Again, these are questions that we've answered within the medical practice of 3D systems in healthcare, but it's open questions, open territories, especially when you cross borders. And that potentially is the ethical part too. If you can do it, should you be doing it? And who's the overseeing body?
I will also say that a lot of the things that you can make with 3D printers, you can make by hand.
Yeah.
So this idea, especially around the gun comment, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And it didn't make sense to me because right now, if I want to make a gun, I can make a gun pretty easily. It's not actually that difficult. 3D printing actually probably makes it harder. To be honest, if you really want to 3D print something, a gun, it's going to take you a lot longer than it does to just go out and buy the parts and put it together.
Your guest.
Surprise?
Andreas. Yes. He's joined us from Tijuana, Mexico, where he's studying under.
Bienvenido.
So outside of the U.S., there's regulations, or there are, but they're not followed. Since all this is usually open source, all these medical applications will affect others. What about certification? Assuming that the certification in other countries outside of the U.S.
So I think you're presenting a problem. The question is, how are you going to validate? How are you going to to credential your product when you're overseas and everything's open source. And my counter to that is everything won't be open source. That's why there's space for companies, both small and large, to have a brand name around quality. And doing that might be receiving regulation in, in the European Union or in the United States first, or following certain protocols, or being very transparent about things. It's a question that some of the local nonprofit global health organizations in San Francisco have really addressed, and we could talk about it offline.
Right, so the first point is that much of it, especially the stuff with great commercial potential, is not actually open source. Speaking for the parts that are open source, some of the issues that arise are we have had cases of people in Latin America, as a matter of fact, who've picked up some of our designs, and they're now using them and selling them without crediting the organization, which I am not sure I have a problem with, but some of my fellow members have a problem with. And they're charging substantial amounts of money, which, again, I'm not sure I have a problem with, but some of my fellows who own those designs or who put those designs out in the world under the assumption that they would be providing solutions for free, they have problems with it. The whole question of how do you certify? This is a genuine enable hand and we think it's going to work. That phrase may put us into big trouble for liability issues and all sorts of other issues. So the landscape for this kind of thing is really quite murky.
Intellectual property, especially manufacturing patents that have what are the shortcomings of 3D printing? If you're trying to scale up and you go back to milling and tooling.
Yeah.
I can answer the second half of that question. So, what are the limitations of 3D printing, and then what is the potential to scale 3D printing? I think that the Invisalign example is proof in case that you can scale to the until you have all of the market share and an entire industry is disrupted with 3D printing. I think some of the limitations are time and materials, but these things are being worked on and iterated on. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that while 3D printing has been here since the 80s, it was founded by the founder of 3D Systems. It's still sort of at an exciting inflection point where there's a lot that's going to come online in the coming decade.
I like to describe 3D printing's capabilities as sort of like the tide. And tide has been going out and it's exposing a lot of opportunities that weren't there before. And as the price of the materials goes down, it's one of the largest limiting factors. Access to the printers, technology, and how to design and design tools kind of go up. More and more of those opportunities will surface and also get addressed. 3D printing 1 unit and 3D printing 100 units almost always costs you the same amount of money per unit. I mean, there are some examples in SLS printing, other ones where you can print many units in one, but generally speaking, you're looking at kind of a linear distribution of price, whereas in almost every other manufacturing type, you have a decreasing unit cost. And that just doesn't exist in 3D printing.
Intellectual property?
Yeah, I mean, intellectual property, I don't think that it changes the rules on intellectual property the way that maybe digital encryption is going to, but I think it changes the rules on enforcement. So,
we're trying to figure this out ourselves right now. The question of licensing of designs, the intellectual property issues for 3D printers, I think, are not fundamentally changing. The whole question of whether 3D printed designs are copyrightable is an interesting question. If you reverse engineer a 3D printed object and then produce new files by yourself, which are reverse engineered from that, The license typically is on the design files that made the first product. It's not clear that a reverse engineered product is infringing those files. It's like reverse engineering software. Now that might be patented, but patenting is an expensive problem and so on. When the stakes are high, sooner or later some company pays the attorneys to go to court and to create precedents that establish some of those issues. But in this world, there's so much happening in the what the heck, it's not costing me a lot, let's do it and throw it out there, that a lot of these issues are being, the clarity is being forestalled by the fact that you don't need it in order to get in the game.
3D printing is a really active IP legal ground. I mean, between the different companies, there's a lot of active lawsuits and patent enforcement, especially on the machines, on the technology behind the machines, the materials. There are some materials that you can produce readily in Europe that are just not available in the United States because of patent issues. And there are a lot of companies, especially some of the ones that I am involved with, that don't patent anything, and everything is just secret sauce. Especially around algorithms. So like we talk about scan, design, print. Well, the printing and the design can be copied pretty easily, but the algorithm in the middle is really tough. Like if you want to try to customize a brace or something like that, figuring out how, you have one brace and you have the person scan of their foot, and you have another brace and you scan of their foot, like figuring out a linear relationship and be able to like infer that algorithm is near impossible. So many companies don't talk about what they do there, and they keep it really private.
Yeah, I completely concur, having worked with Scott Summit making digital algorithms to do patient-specific workflows. The last thing I guess I would say about IP is that it really is, to use another aphorism, it's a land grab. Everybody's out there because, lattice structures and things that have not been possible before are now on everybody's attention, and it just hasn't been patented before. So, printers have been patented, but X, Y, and Z haven't, and people are doing it right now because it's visible.
So something I love Enable for a whole bunch of reasons, but the whole maker movement, we talk about all the benefits of makers, there are many, but one of the greatest ones is that once someone publishes how to do something, it can no longer be patented. Yeah. And so you have a lot of makers across the spectrum, some doctors even, doing things like making tracheas, making other kind of stuff. And as soon as they publish how they did it, like being able to patent that and land grabbing it is impossible. Yeah. So you see a lot of that happening, and it's good for the industry. It lifts all boats.
So making one thing has a certain amount of difficulty to it, but making the same thing for lots of people is very difficult, and I think that, again, the secret sauce behind doing that, it's valuable, it takes time to develop, and it doesn't necessarily have to be covered with IP.
I just want to invite the rest of the panel from panel 1. Maybe while we see if there are any other questions, do you have anything to expand on?
One of the things that's interesting about the gun debate is, everything that's pointed out here, it's something that is pretty insignificant in the U.S., but if you're a country like Japan, where guns actually are very hard to come by, it is a more relevant topic. It is an open source thing, which means if you're not a big fan of open source guns, you just download the file, modify it in any kind of creative ways you want, and re-upload it, and the next guy who downloads it will fire it, and all kinds of things can happen to him. So it's going to throw some mistrust into it, because you can have an inherent cat and mouse between the saboteurs of the product and the product itself. Makes you really not want to try that 3D printed gun after all. So as far as whether or not that's going to be the next big threat we have to deal with, probably not. It's going to be more of a threat to the person behind the trigger. So that's one of the things.
Are there any further questions?
I have a quick comment on that as well. Thank you, John. So one of the important things related to what you were just talking about is provenance, right? where does this file come from? Do I trust it, right? Just as with the MP3 revolution and Napster changed the music industry forever, right? And yeah, there was a big crackdown on Napster, but everyone uses MP3s or whatever now, right? And it's moot. At that time, right, the digital rights management became a big thing, and people tried to make file formats that would self-destruct after a certain amount of time, or, digital rights was an important thing. And then that didn't work. Encryption didn't work, right? And so then the companies started suing everybody. That didn't work. Finally, the entire business changed, right? And iTunes and Google Play and Amazon and everybody else started offering the new thing in a way that could still make money and still be profitable, but was commensurate with what the customer wanted. I think we may see that with 3D printing, and it'd be wise on our part to avoid rights management and suing everybody, and get to the point where we change business first, instead of having to suffer through 10 or 20 years of that kind of misery.
The largest sharers of illegal MP3s are the artists and the groups that own the rights to that music. They publish them, they share them, and they're all degraded quality, have issues in the middle of them, make it a bad experience to own. Scott's point.
Yeah, just to add to that, in this industry, what I find so beautiful about it is that it's a lot about collaboration, and it's just so new. So the designers and the makers, they can all collaborate together, and I think that is so powerful. This one woman, actually, that I spoke to the other day, it was really cute, kind of inappropriate, but I'm going to say it anyways. She said, I feel like we should move from this new economy to a relationship economy, instead of this one-night stand economy that we're living in. Just because everything is just so fast, very quick, and sometimes the quality isn't as good, and it's just really important to collaborate with each other and to build a relationship economy. So I hope that wasn't too inappropriate.
It's Saturday.
It's Saturday.
I had a question. So there were some references to doctors publishing papers about building. So being a doctor, how do they do it? I mean, is it the software that enables them to do that, or they have to have this designer, some mechanical friend of mine that helps them do that?
The software for that is fairly sophisticated. You're not going to pick that up and learn it on a long weekend. So a lot of times that will be somebody with a BME background and whatnot. I was just out at a group called the Jacobs Institute in Buffalo, New York, and they're doing some very sophisticated stuff using some very fancy new 3D modeling software that allows them to do things that are like soft tissue modeling for vascular structures and things like that. Software is actually playing catch up with this. Software as it exists now was developed for making 747s, not for making complex digital materials that were meant to be 3D printed. So there's this evolution that's happening very rapidly there, and also with the democratization of software too. It was not meant ever to be, the evolution of the 3D modeling software was not meant for novices, it was meant for professionals. Now there's a scramble to see how low can you go, how easy can you make very sophisticated stuff so that a non-user can actually do very fancy things without realizing that they're doing fancy things.
Kind of like the Tinkercad that was mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
or even Google SketchUp, right? That makes architecture something that anybody can do.
I just want to add on that. I'll save the microphone. We have a software package within 3D Systems called Freeform, which has a different type of interface, which is used by predominantly in healthcare. So it has a haptic pen that gives you force feedback, so you can feel when you're on top of bone or inside of bone, and it more closely resembles the surgical experience. It helps reduce barriers for surgeons to get involved in the design process. And I think we're about to announce a really dramatic price cut in the actual haptic device from $10,000 to the $500-600 price range. So it's coming.
And it wasn't that long ago that you had to use Photoshop if you wanted to edit photos. I think Instagram and the other kinds of, even in Facebook or Twitter, you can just automatically do all these professional looking edits now. I think the same thing is coming for 3D models.
So that's all going to change, but I will point out that this is a world in which if you are a physician who is not of a mechanical bent, there is a non-physician who is of a mechanical bent who would be thrilled to work with you, and they're a browser away.
I think we'll end with that, and if you have a chance, maybe one last view of upstairs if you haven't seen the demo area yet. But thank you to the panelists.